All right, welcome everybody to today's webinar. We're excited to be talking about how inside sales teams go from good to great using advanced selling tactics. Now, we do have a special guest with us today, Kerry Cunningham. Kerry is the Senior Research Director at Serious Decisions, and then you got myself, Gabe Larson, and I run Inside Sales Labs. Kerry, can you just take a minute and tell us just a little bit about yourself and some of the cool things you do over there at Serious Decisions?
Sure thing. First of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. So I'm a Senior Research Director at Serious Decisions, which means I spend about half of my time talking with our clients about how to optimize their marketing and sales functions. And primarily, I work in the area of teleservices and predictive analytics. So I spend a lot of time working with our clients on how to optimize things. One of the great things about my job is that I get to look inside of what our clients are doing every day. So every day, I see how many different organizations are operating their inside sales, teleprospecting, telequal teams. And so I learn a lot. My job is to kind of decipher what's good, what's bad, and to promote what's good to the rest of the world. I've been in this business and in and around this space for 20 or so years. I ran a large third-party teleservices organization strictly in the B2B space for about 15 years. In addition to that, I've got a lot of experience working in and with predictive analytics vendors, and sort of advanced analytics in that respect. So that's why I'm on the call today. What I do for a living, it's kind of fun, and then I get to be in conversations like this one.
Fantastic. So Kerry brings a lot to the conversation. As he said, he's got some specialty areas, but he has been around and I think seen a lot of the best companies do what they do. So I'll be excited to jump in to the topic at hand in just a minute here, Kerry. But before we do, some housekeeping items. Number one, if you've not already checked it out, you should. If you have recommendations on guests, we run the Playmaker podcast twice a week. Fun dialogue. Guys like Kerry. In fact, Kerry owes me an episode. We got to get this guy on. We keep it a little more informal. We'll do the webinar today, Kerry, and then maybe we'll have to do a podcast a little bit later. But do check it out. You can see it at InsideSales.com podcast, or you can just look up on iTunes, Google, Stitcher, Playmaker podcast. Now, for those of you who don't like podcasts, we do like to continue the conversation on Facebook. You can join the Facebook Playmaker group. Live conversations, really good dialogue around what kind of plays you're running, things that are working in sales, things that are not working. If you're interested in that, go find, search Playmaker group on Facebook, or hit me up on LinkedIn or Facebook, and I'll make sure you get in. We've got a link right here that you can click on if you want to check that out. So please join it because, again, we'd love to continue the dialogue. For those of you who are asking, we've got the webinar is going to last 30-ish minutes, depending on how much Kerry and I debate back and forth. You can join the conversation, #Playmaker, or #InsideSalesWebinar, and we will make sure you get some of this on demand following the session. So I do want to make sure, I know everybody who's on, we've been doing so many of these webinars, I'm starting to recognize names and faces. So I want to make sure we know who's live on the cast today. So if you can, grab that Q&A box in the bottom left-hand corner, type your name and where you're from. We've already got Stephen Lord. Stephen, I'm glad you're here. Steve and I have been talking back and forth around optimal plays. We're going to go a little deeper, Stephen, and I think Kerry's going to bring a lot, so thanks so much for joining. Michael, I see you're on. Always good to have you. Dan, Jamie, Jessica, Rich, Deborah, good, guys. Keep using that Q&A box, and let's get into it. So, Kerry, let's jump into the conversation. We're going to be talking a little bit about this concept of the science of teleservices. You're around it a lot, and I want to actually get into some more formal questions that you and I have kind of debated a little back and forth, but I'd love for you to just kind of set the stage around, what is this world of teleservices that we're living in, and how can we start thinking about it?
Sure, that's great. So, first of all, let's kind of define what we mean. So there's inside sales as a function where we've got people on the phone actually closing deals, right? And then there's an awful lot of people on the phone who are doing things like lead qualification, taking leads from marketing and qualifying those. They're doing outbound prospecting, handling chats, handling other kind of electronic forms of communication. We're talking about all of those things today. I think everything we talk about today is going to apply pretty equally well to all. Now, one of the things that we have at Serious Decisions that we work with our clients on is this way of kind of structuring our thinking around this function. And so we call this the 8-factor model of lead development, so substitute inside sales or whatever you want for the term lead development. But what we do is we break down this function into the 8 key sub-disciplines that we think are critical to master to really optimize. The first of these things is culture, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it today, but we'll touch on it in just a minute. When I talk about culture, I'm not talking about whether you have a foosball table in the break room or a softball team or something like that. What we're talking about is how the things that, how the things that you talk about in your organization every day, how you reward and recognize your employees, your sales reps, your lead development reps, how do those things impact their behavior, right? So that's what we're trying to do here is impact behavior. And the things that we recognize and reward people for impact their behavior in a very strong way, and particularly when we talk about what people do either when nobody's looking, which is often the case, or when there aren't specific rules that help us tell us what to do in a given situation. It's the culture of our organization that decides how people are going to behave. And so what we want is for our people who are talking to prospects and customers to have great conversations with them. And the question that we ask is, does the culture that we have in our organization support our reps having great conversations with our prospects? Very simple question. It's actually pretty easy to answer. If the only thing that you talk about ever are whether you're reaching your goals as an inside sales group, then the answer is no. You're not doing anything that's going to cause good conversations with the prospects, right? Now, I'm not going to say that you shouldn't be talking about making your goals. You absolutely should and you must. But if that's the only thing you ever talk about, your prospects are suffering as a result. So that's like the first factor. Get that right, talk about what's important to have a great customer experience. The second thing is the design of the job. Sounds fancy. What it really means is, do you have really clear goals for the job? And then are the things that you ask your inside sales reps, your teleprospectors, those folks, are those things aligned to the goals for the job? Very, very simple. What we often find is that we have these folks doing a lot of things every day that really aren't very closely aligned to what they're supposed to be doing and what we pay them for, right? And if that's the case, they're not going to perform at the highest possible level. Another piece of this is how we pay them variable compensation. This is probably done poorly in 75–80% of the companies that I work with. And one of the primary mistakes that people make is paying for outcomes that are outside of the control of the inside sales rep. If that inside sales rep isn't closing the deal and that deal closes 9 months from now, giving them compensation for that closed deal is not going to change their behavior at all. It's going to make them feel better, and I don't say that you shouldn't do it, but it isn't going to change their behavior. You have to do something else in order to modify their behavior, so we'll talk about that in a minute as well. The third factor, and we'll spend more time talking about this, I think, than anything else today, is measurement. Are we measuring things that actually matter? And when we talk about actually mattering, what that means is, if I have a rep who's really productive and then another rep who's really not, do my metrics tell me why there's a difference between the two? Most metrics that we see don't do that. And so that's the foundation we think of for building a great inside sales lead development team. And then on top of that sits some building blocks. So if you designed the job and you built it well, then you'll know which kind of people you need to put in the job. What are the talents that those people are going to have and bring to the role? And if you know what talents they're going to bring to the role and what they have to do, then you know what you're going to have to give them when they arrive. How are you going to have to develop them? What do you provide in terms of skills and knowledge when those people arrive? And next is supporting them. So what do you do, and we're going to talk about this a lot today too, but what do you do to support them in executing their job on a day-by-day, minute-by-minute basis? Absolutely critical, and there's a lot to talk about there. The targets. So are we calling the right companies, and are we calling the right people inside the right companies? You can build a great machine based on the other 6 things I just talked about, but if you point them at the wrong targets, you're still not going to produce a good result. So that's another really critical factor. And then, of course, there's the layer of management that sits on top of this whole thing to make sure that we're doing what we said we were going to do, that we're operating the way we expected to operate, and that we notice when we're not and we can do something about it. So that's the framework that we look at this whole function in, to kind of break down. You know, there's an awful lot going on in this function. This helps us kind of organize our thinking around what we need to do and what we need to operate to do well. So I'll just pause there before we go and jump and talk about measurement a little bit, and see, Gabe, if you have anything that.
No, that's perfect. I appreciate it, Kerry. So is this specific to just kind of the concept of lead development? I mean, it seems like this has some universal applicability. Or do you feel like that's true, or do you feel like that, you know, this really only hones into the kind of that teleservices or lead development team?
Yeah, no, it absolutely is applicable to inside sales. It's applicable to really to any client-facing function, if you want to think about it. So in most of the things that we talk about here are pretty universal in how you design an organization and work with and develop the people who are in it. So I end up talking mostly to lead development teams, but it applies equally well to folks that are doing closing deals and inside sales as well.
Yeah, interesting. So we got a couple questions coming in, but I'm going to hold those as we get into a couple more tactical things. But I'd love to ask the audience, hit my Q&A if you can. What do you think of the 8-factor model as you think about building a lead development team? Any questions that kind of resonate with you as you look through this chart? So as those come in, Kerry, I want to move to the next piece, and I want to get into this idea of measurement, because I know there's a lot of this, but so many ideas around what can we measure, what shouldn't we measure. You know, some people go more top of funnel, some people go more bottom of funnel. Would love to hear your thoughts as you guys have debated, discussed, and done research about this particular area around numbers.
Yep, absolutely. So first thing I want to say about measurement is that the whole idea of measurement is to understand variability. Why do some people perform better than some other people? Why does one person perform better in one period of time than another period of time? And if your measurements don't do that, then you don't need those measurements. Now, most people in the inside sales, teleprospecting, phone-based anything industry assume that the measurements that we've had forever do that they account for variability. And our research, and I'm really, really interested to hear what you found, because I think you guys have some really great data. But our research says that the basic things that we've been looking at for years, they don't do that. They do not help you account for very much of the variability, and really that's all we need to do is account for variability. Why is one rep better than another? That's the question. Now, before we get to the kind of specifics of the measurement piece of it, I want to touch on an aspect of measurement in inside sales and lead development teams that is rarely ever considered, but really important. So, you know, I talked about culture and the fact that culture is important. It's not about the foosball. It's really about how you drive the right kinds of conversations. So what you measure about somebody's job is a very strong and important communication to that person and those people about what you value in their job. I think everybody would agree with that, right? We measure what we think we value. So I'll use this analogy. This is just my little homely analogy for this. And I'm going to assume that virtually everybody in the audience today is a manager of some kind or another. If your boss put a blackboard outside your office and every day came up to your office and typed and put on that blackboard how many words you had typed on the prior day, and then on the days where you typed a lot of words, maybe you got a gold star, and if you had a goal for the week of words typed, you would try to exceed that goal, and maybe you would get a pat on the back for that. Now, that sounds ridiculous, because if you're a manager in business, you have important things to do. You have value that you need to add to the business, and you may have to type words in order to get that value across, but it's not the typing that matters, right? So most of us would feel very quickly, if this was the way we were being measured, that our boss didn't really appreciate the value that we bring to the job and the unique skills and talents that we have. But this is exactly what we do with inside sales reps and teleprospectors every day, when what we measure is pure activity. If the only things that we measure are how many times somebody dials the phone, and how many times somebody sends an email, and how many minutes they spend on that phone, then what we're measuring are things that are purely rote activity that, as we'll see in a minute, don't really account for variability, but also don't have anything to do with the unique value and skills that that individual brings. And because they don't, they're not going to encourage that individual to develop those unique values and skills. So I hope that makes sense to everybody. Gabe, keep me honest on that one.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think a lot of people, this is the debate, we're getting some questions coming in, just about, should we be focusing more on kind of that top of funnel? Should we be focusing more on that bottom of funnel? But it sounds like you're advocating that we move a little bit away from, just focusing on activities, but getting to something that can get a little closer to variance, which potentially is a little further down the funnel than just activities.
Yeah, so and it depends. I think we should define what we mean by funnel in this case, or what the parameters are for the funnel. But if we thought about from the time an inside sales rep receives a lead or a record to call, and the time that they produce an output from it, if we think about that as the time that this is the place where they can create some value and cause something to happen, then we need to have measurements that account for variability across the whole length of the span of that period of time. So I'll show you something, and I'd be interested to know if you have data that is similar, contradicts, or confirms this. But we looked at a ton of data over a long period of time. And so think of this pie chart that's on the screen right now as the pie chart of all of the things that impact rep performance. And so in this case, we measure rep performance by the percentage of times that you produce the outcome you're supposed to produce. In some cases, it's a closed sale in the data that we looked at. In some cases, it's a qualified lead or an appointment. And then we looked at the standard variables: dials, talk time, and connects. So dials and talk time, I think everybody understands. Connects means a live person picked up the phone. These are the three variables that we see most often in most organizations. And I've drawn this pie chart to scale. So when we look at these three variables and we put them in regression formulas, what we find is that they account for about a quarter to a third of the difference between your top reps and the rest. In other words, if I know these three things about my team, I can understand about a third of the reason why some reps are better than others. But that leaves an awful lot of the variability left unaccounted for. So let me pause, Gabe, keep me honest here. Does that make sense to everybody the way that I've described that?
Yeah, so let me see if so you're saying that this is basically going into what variables drive the difference in high performance among sales teams, and you're saying that other metrics outside of dial, talk time, and connects are kind of what is driving some of that the difference, I guess?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think we all know this from looking at our teams. If you manage a team, your best performer is hardly ever the person who's the leader in these three categories. And I think anecdotally, almost everybody would say, oh, yeah, that makes sense, right? That tells us that we have to measure something else. No, I would contend that if you had a perfect measure of what a rep actually says when somebody picks up the phone on the other end, that would account for an awful lot of the rest of the variability. But those perfect measures are hard to find. So the question is, what can we come up with that's going to help us understand why some reps are effective? And I think we could think of those things as being in a couple of different categories. So one is going to be, it is going to be a measure of what they say, right? How effective it is what a rep says in getting a prospect to stay on the phone with them, to listen to them, and ultimately to engage and to buy if it's buying, or to take a meeting. Another could be, are we applying the right level of effort to the right prospects, and this is something I think I'm really interested in talking with you about today. So, and when we get to that question, it's really, if I make one call to each of the leads that, marketing sends me, what's my likely conversion rate of those leads if I just made one call to each of those, right? And then if I made 2 calls, does that change my conversion rate on those leads? Am I likely to convert more? And if I make 3, 4, 5, et cetera. So I think we would all agree that just making one call to each lead that we get is probably not going to produce a very good result, right? If we just made one call and stopped and then moved on. There's also a point at which if we continue making calls past a certain number into each lead, we're just wasting our time trying to reach people who aren't going to respond, right? So the critical thing is to figure out what is the optimal number of attempts to make and to operate within that optimal range as often as possible. And that's an area in which you all have done a bunch of research, and I'd love to hear some more about that. So I'll pause for just a second, take a check on what I've said so far and see what kinds of questions, comments. Yeah, Bud, how about whatever?
Yeah. Well, one interesting question, maybe, Kerry, real quick is, I don't want to go too far down a wrong path here, but just an interesting question. Looking at the current slide we're looking at, do you have a feel or a quick thought on, compensation? Sometimes people debate should we compensate around some of these activity or contact talk time that you're seeing here? Should we go further? Yeah. Any quick thoughts around compensation for these teams? I know we're not going to get into that too much, but a couple of questions in the queue about it.
Sure. I love to talk about compensation because it's obviously super important. It's also something that most people get wrong, in my experience. All right, so 2 different things. If you're in a sales environment where your inside sales reps are actually closing deals, just pay them to close deals. Don't pay them for anything else. That's what they're there for. Pay them base pay, and we can talk about ratio of base pay to variable comp and all of that, but don't pay for activities. Exactly the same thing applies to a lead development rep who's qualifying leads or prospecting and setting appointments. I would recommend never paying for anything other than the outcome that you're interested in that position producing. So if the goals for that position are to produce qualified appointments that a sales rep can put in their pipeline, then pay that rep variable compensation when an appointment they produce hits pipeline. If that job is there to close deals, then pay that rep when their deal closes. That make sense?
Yeah. I mean, we're getting a couple debates here, and again, let's answer this. And I want to get back to the topic at hand. A lot of people saying, should you pay on just the opportunity being created? Should you pay on the opportunity being kind of accepted at the appointment being created or the appointment being held, or should you go and pay on something deeper, close? There's a lot of people saying, it's just best to tie all these sales development or lead development reps to the close. That's ultimately what we want. Any thoughts on kind of those 3 ideas? Sorry. Yeah.
So here, and this goes back to some of the basic principles of how to construct compensation plans that are going to work for reps. And this is part of my academic background in organizational psychology. But one of the things that you have to do is make sure that if you're going to pay variable compensation to somebody, that they have a high degree of control over the outcome that you're paying them for. So if a rep produces a lead and that lead goes to a sales rep and the sales rep works it for 6 months before they put it into their pipeline, it's not going to be any good to pay the rep who produced the lead based on it getting into pipeline. It's just too far out, and you're going to lose the connection between the activity and the outcome. So in that case, I would, you want the sales rep to say accept the lead and do it with some integrity. Like, talk to the prospect. Yes, this seems like a good prospect. I can't put it into pipeline yet, but this was a good lead for me to get. Okay, that's an okay time to pay the rep for producing that if, it's still going to be a while before that thing gets to pipeline. If you have deals that go to pipeline on the second conversation that a sales rep has with the prospect, and that usually happens within a month, then it's fine to wait till that thing goes to pipeline with the rep. But that control that the rep has over the outcome is what drives the behavioral change. And that's the question you have to ask. If the rep doesn't have control over that outcome, then what happens is two things. People like human beings, when we have important outcomes that we don't control, we have two responses. The first response is to give up and become apathetic. I can't control the outcome, so I don't care. The second one is to become depressed. I don't control the outcome. I'm bummed out. I'm just going to sit here. They look the same. They perform the same. They're emotionally a little bit difficult, a little bit different, but the outcome, the answer is the same either way. It doesn't help. So pay for outcomes that the rep controls, and pay as soon as you can. So if your inside sales team or lead development team, like most teams, is pretty young, in their 20s, then chances are their timelines for what matters to them are shorter than yours are if you're in your 30s or 40s or later. And so they're going to be motivated by things that happen that are rewarded much sooner. And this isn't a millennial thing or a generational thing. It's just, when we're younger, we need our rewards a little sooner. And as we get older, we have longer timelines. So pay as soon as you can, and pay on an outcome that the reps control.
I love it. I love it. Interesting. Well, again, didn't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but Philip, a couple others, John, Katie, they had asked about that, so wanted to make sure we did get that out for you. So let's jump back in. So we were just kind of finishing up measurement. Any last thoughts on that, or you want to kind of finish up that piece, Kerry?
Yeah, so a couple of things that I did want to point out, and I wanted to get your input from the inside sales perspective and your data. One of the measurements that we've looked at over time across lots and lots of different data sets, lots of clients, has to do with length of calls, but it's not talk time. And I think this is a really important distinction for people to think about. So talk time is typically measured in number of minutes per day that a rep spends on the phone. And Gabe, I'd love to hear what you guys see, but we typically see not much more than an hour of talk time, or an hour and a half of talk time in a day for a lot of our clients. Mm-hmm. Do you see things like that?
Hour and a half.
Yeah,
that's right. Hour and a half. Mm-hmm.
So when we see, one of the things to notice about it, so remember, we're looking for variability, and how do we account for variability? And what I see when we look at data is that there isn't actually very much variability in that talk time on teams. Like virtually everybody on the team ends up with more or less the same kind of talk time, give or take a few minutes every day. And when you have that situation, it's kind of logical to think if there's not much difference in that measure, it's going to be hard for that difference in that measure to account for a big difference in the outcomes that they produce. Right? And I hope that makes sense to everybody. So in looking at data, what we did was, and this is across a bunch of different clients, we computed a winning percentage. So the winning percentage is just of all the calls that a rep made, how many of them turned into the outcome that they were goaled to produce. And this could have been across many different kinds of outcomes, from closing sales to setting appointments. And then we looked at a bunch of different variables and constructed a bunch of different variables to try to figure out what matters. And here's what we found. So if you take the winning percentage, being that circle, we computed this measure that says of the calls that a rep makes, how many of those calls are longer than 3 minutes? Now, 3 minutes may not seem very long, but that is the very long tail end of the curve of calls. Most calls are well under a minute long. So reps who have a lot of calls that are longer than 3 minutes, that correlates pretty strongly as a single variable with winning percentage. In fact, that overlap is about 32%. Different clients that we looked at. So if you measure the calls that your reps have that are longer than 3 minutes, you're going to have another variable that's going to help you account for a lot of variability. Now, one of the interesting things is, if you look at talk time and put it in the same statistical model, it barely overlaps either one. So I already said this about 10 times today, that total talk time and winning percentage are unrelated. The people who have all the talk time are not the same people who have the highest winning percentages. The really interesting thing is that the people who have all the talk time are not the same people who have all the long calls. And that one was, it was a little surprising for me to see when I first saw it, and I've seen it over and over again in many different data sets. What this says is that there are reps who are doing a good job of engaging many, many people throughout the day in relatively long conversations. Like if it's over 3 minutes, that means that the prospect engaged with the person and agreed to do so. They weren't, if they were trying to get rid of your rep, they would have done it in less than 3 minutes. And so the ones who are much more likely to be successful, but they're not the same people who end up with one 40-minute call and then a bunch of 20 other 1-minute calls, right? There's a big difference between somebody who has 20 3-minute calls and somebody who has 3 calls that end up totaling an hour, but most of it's wrapped up in one. All right, Gabe, I don't know if you have any comments or thoughts about this measure.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly agree with you. The one thing we've debated is trying to figure out what is the number around that kind of conversation rate. Is it 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, or 5 minutes? I don't actually have a good answer for it, but certainly there is this pivot point around solid conversations. I mean, if you are having really good conversations, you are more likely to, you called it here, winning percent. You're more likely to be able to move people down the pipeline. And so there is a pivotal point on this, and it's not just about connects. It is about quality conversations. But I don't know if we've got data to really substantiate around how many minutes that is at the moment.
Well, let's put a pin on the wall to take a look at that, and then we can do one of your podcasts about that later on. Because this is a fun thing to look at. Now, we've seen this, so a little bit of background on this 3 minutes. So across a data set that had a couple dozen different clients and a few million records, we saw 3 minutes as the number that had the highest partial correlation in a regression formula with winning percentage. What I've seen in individual clients is that number can vary. It can vary a little bit, up to around 4 minutes or so. I haven't seen it go below 3 minutes, but it's usually in the 3 to 4 minute range. So somewhere in that range, there's a range that says if your rep is getting people to talk to them for longer than this amount of time and they're doing that consistently, what that means is that the prospect, when they say, is saying no, that they're not buying right now, that maybe they don't want to buy from you, but maybe they're not buying from anybody right now. If they say no in less time than that, like if somebody says no in 2 minutes, chances are that 2 minutes was 2 minutes where the prospect was waiting to get a word in edgewise so they could say, I'm not interested, and hang up. So if it's a shorter no, then chances are the no is, I don't want to talk to you. If it's a longer no, the no is, I'm not a buyer. I get it. I've heard it. I understand, but I'm not a buyer. Right? So those no's that are, I'm not a buyer, that's a much better no than the no, I don't want to talk to you. Because the no, I don't want to talk to you is going to end up with a lot of false negatives. Right? You could have a lot of people in there who are buyers who think this person is unpleasant to talk to and I don't want to do it. Right? Whereas that 3 minute one, it's more likely, it's not 100% by any means, that no after 3 minutes means, I'm not buying today. Or my company's not buying, right? And that's what we're trying to get to with this, is get to, these are, I always use baseball analogies here. It's, are you having really good at bats? Did you go up and swing at 3 pitches that are outside of the strike zone? Or did you make the pitcher throw the ball in the strike zone, and did you take a good cut at a pitch that you think you could hit?
Yeah, no, that does make sense. That 3 minute, that's an interesting one here. Let's see, a couple other questions coming in. What factors contribute to a high quality conversation besides achieving the desired outcome, i.e. teaching prospects something about the new industry, showing empathy, building rapport? That may come up a little later. That's a question from Kyle. Any quick thoughts on that, Kerry?
Yeah. Well, first of all, are we talking about the prospect's business, or are we talking about ourselves? Do we look? That's one of the primary reasons that people don't want to talk to phone reps at all is because they hardly ever get to talk about themselves, right? You hardly ever get to talk about, I have interests in my business, and I have needs I need to address. Do I get to talk about those? Are you helping me figure out how to solve those? Or are you trying to sell me something, whether I need it or not? And so to me, a genuine dialogue with a prospect is one in which I understand something about that prospect's business needs. That prospect ends up understanding something about whether we have a solution or not. And we come to an agreement by the end of that call about whether it's worthwhile pursuing our solution to their problem. And the right context for this, and people don't like to hear this, but the right context is the vast majority of prospects you talk to at any given point in time are not buyers right now for what you sell, right? If they were, we would have a much, much smaller set of salespeople who would make much, much more money, and we would have them talk to all of those prospects, right? If they were all going to buy. But the truth is, people are always looking, they're interested, they're looking for future solutions, but most of them are not actually buying right now, right? Our job is to make sure that we have a good enough conversation so that we understand which ones are buying right now, and we have a chance to sell to them. And then the ones who aren't buying right now, which of those are people who are going to be buying at some point, where we need to make a good impression so that they come away from the call thinking, yep, these guys can solve this problem for us when we're ready to solve it. Right? And then there's a set of people who are just not going to be buyers, and then we want to spend as little time with them as possible. Does that make sense? Would you all agree with that?
No,
anybody think?
Yeah, I'd love to, Kyle, you can kind of hit us back if you feel like you want to add to that. One other question, Kerry, that came in, and then we could potentially move on here. For the 3-minute call, that's actual live talking. That doesn't consist of a ring time or I guess ring time. I mean, it's literally the 3 minutes is when the conversation starts to when the conversation ends. Correct?
That's right. Yeah, and
okay.
I'll add one more interesting twist to this. You would think that who you're talking to and having these 3-minute conversations should matter a lot. And so when I did the statistics on this, I controlled for the title of the person that we're talking to. So, you coded the title. Is this a decision maker or influencer, or is it somebody else? And what we found is that it doesn't matter. So the reps who are having 3-minute plus conversations, those conversations could be with anybody. As long as you're having these 3-minute plus conversations and lots of them, you're going to be more effective. And that's a little bit counterintuitive. I'll say my explanation, and you can poke holes in it, or maybe people have others. But what I think is going on here is, first of all, an hour of talk time, which is kind of typical in an hour, is not a lot of time to be practicing your craft, right? So if you're only spending an hour of time on the phone a day, and you're probably only actually talking for part of that, then it's very difficult to actually be practicing what you're doing and being very good at it, right? So simply having more practice, having more at-bats is probably good for you as a rep. The other thing is, if the only thing I'm doing is hitting voicemail and occasionally catching a person live and talking to them, then I'm limited by fortune and chance in how many conversations I'm going to have. But if I'm working really hard and I get out of voicemail and I go find an assistant to talk to, and I genuinely engage that assistant so that I can find out when the right time to talk to the decision maker is, and if there's somebody else I can talk to, and by the way, do you know what you're using for this solution today, or what you're doing for that? And if I do that on a regular basis, I'm absolutely going to improve my odds of being successful. And so I think, while our observations there are absolutely anecdotal, I think that's what's going on. So interested to hear what you might think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think we run into this problem of quantity versus quality, and certainly I think quality is going to trump, and I think conversations is an interesting point to bring it around. you know, one of the things that people are asking is, you know, how does an email or a chat or a social fit into this? You know, so many people are bringing in other forms of communication. Do you know, and a lot of, especially a lot of people are not anti-phone, but they're concerned about the phone, and they say, you know, nobody's answering the phone. We actually, I'm kicking myself right now, Kerry, because we actually are looking at doing a phone study. We've almost got 1 billion phone calls, about 750 million phone calls is what we're analyzing right now. But unfortunately, we don't have more, we don't go too far down the pipe. We can't tie it to winning percentage. It's killing me. But pure side note there, as I listen to you talk about phone calls and winning percentage. But anyways, you know, a lot of people are a little nervous about the phone. So is there a way you tie into this really important metric of conversations in 3 minutes with email and chat or social, or is there not quite a way you can do that?
Yeah, so, you know, I think this is an area where you need to do a lot more work because this is going to change. So the numbers I'm talking about today, purely conversation
purely
time.
Phone.
And I think, and I think, you know, the world is continuing to migrate toward what I consider, kind of not to be too academic about this, but there's synchronous and asynchronous communications. Synchronous, we're standing in front of each other or talking on the phone back and forth in real time. Asynchronous, you send me a message, I respond whenever the heck I want. Right? So most of us actually prefer asynchronous interactions with people we don't know. Right? It just stands to reason. I'll respond when I feel like it. And now an asynchronous conversation can go on for a long time. It can be very productive. It can be the thing that people prefer, but it's really hard to measure, or at least how we measure it hasn't been established. So I think that we've got to figure out how we get to the point where we do measure these things. Now, we can look at the rate of engagement with people's IMs, with people's emails, et cetera, and I think get to a point where we do measure, okay, if one rep starts chatting with a prospect, how likely is that chat to continue? How many chats are there? What's the outcome of those? Same thing with email. So I think we can get there, but we don't have the data yet, as you suggested. One of the things I think is really important about this is just to keep in mind the ultimate goal. We have to have a good interaction with a prospect if we're going to get to the outcomes what we want. That interaction doesn't have to be in a live voice conversation, but we do have to have a real dialogue back and forth with that prospect. And so if we use digital media to set up that dialogue so that the prospect gets to decide when they have a phone conversation with us, that's great, and that's how it's used mostly today. If a prospect just prefers to do an IM back and forth for a half an hour instead of having a 5-minute phone conversation, that's fine too, if that's what they want to do, right? So to be seen on how we measure that, but I'm interested to hear what people are doing there.
Yeah, I think that is going to be, one thing I will say is, I mean, there's obviously power in all forms of communication, but as you try to move from kind of less assertive to more assertive media, I think you're going to continue selling people over chat and selling people over email. I don't think you get the richness that you obviously do in kind of those live, real conversations. And as you move it to video and in person, I think the power increases. So I'm always a fan of trying to always move people down that paradigm and get them more into the live interaction so that you can help close deals. But you're right, to be determined, I think, as we see these up-and-coming communications really nailed down and how we can best measure. We're dying to get into a couple of these other pieces, Kerry. Can we continue the dialogue? I'll hold some of these questions a little bit longer. I apologize for interrupting, but great conversation.
Yeah, no problem. I think we've been talking about a lot of the things that we did want to talk about ultimately, so that's great. I think, part of the big thing that we want to get to is talking about the kinds of cadences and sequences of calls. And you guys are doing a lot of work around the playbooks, which I think is really important. So a couple of things here, and I mentioned this just in passing earlier. So point one, I think everybody would agree making just one contact attempt, one call, one email, whatever, to each prospect is not going to get the job done, but it's equally bad to make an unlimited number or just a random number of attempts to each prospect. Right? Neither of those two things make sense. Unfortunately, when I look at the data, and you can, again, tell me what you see, when I look at the data from our clients, what we often see is an average, is following up on marketing-generated leads, for instance, an average of something like 1.2 to 1.5 calls per lead. In other words, almost no effort toward making contact with a prospect.
Yeah,
and that's
real quick, Kerry, on that. Is that typically is that just a contact that's entered into my database via more of an account-based model, or is that a lead that actually comes into my system via a lead form?
That number is specific to leads, like a marketing-generated lead that came through marketing automation. In prospecting, we do see more calls per account, but still a really small number relative to what the data suggests would work.
Yeah, so this may be interesting. We actually have a study coming out on Thursday where we looked at, man, I don't know if I have it off the top of my head. We looked at about 15,000 inbound leads because we wanted to see, we were tracking at about 1 to 1.5 average activities. Now, this is, there is difference between phone calls and emails. So our original data said we kind of had the one phone call as well. But now as we're looking at it, we've got an average of about 4.05 total activities per lead that we're seeing. But to your point, that still translates to about one and a half email, 1.5 phone calls, 1.5 voice message. We're kind of including a voice message as a touch there. But anyway, food for thought on that.
Yeah. So I'm interested to see how that works out because, the bottom bullet point here is really it's the punchline, which is if you leave the decision about how much effort to apply to each prospect up to the rep in every moment, you're going to get a highly variable result, right? Your reps are very often the youngest, least trained, least experienced people in your organization as a group. Now, you have exceptions to that on every team. Those exceptions may perform very well, but it's everybody else who's not. And it's on average, your team is average. On average, your team is not your excellent performers. So there's so much available, especially if you're using a tool like InsideSales.com. There's so much data available, so much that you can understand about how much effort you should be applying and what's going to work best, that it's becoming criminal negligence to leave the decision about how much effort to make up to your individual reps. I'm going to push through a couple of pretty wonky slides here just to make this point because I mentioned this earlier. So here's what I would suggest everybody do, or have InsideSales.com do it for you. But create a chart where you ask the question, on leads where you just made one attempt, what was your conversion rate? So certainly you have in your system leads where you only made one attempt and then nothing else happened after that. What's your conversion rate? How many of those turned into the outcome that you wanted? And do that for the, where you made 2 contact attempts and 3 contact attempts, et cetera. Right? So what you'll find ultimately is that produces a curve. Now, hopefully it produces a curve. But on one side, on the left side of the curve, you're going to find that if you didn't make enough opportunities where, if your best conversion rate happens in leads where you make 4 attempts, but you only made 3 on average, that means that you're leaving a lot of possibilities untapped and you have a lot of wasted opportunity. On the other hand, if you're making, if you have records where you're making 18 contact attempts, but your average number of attempts where you produce a lead is 3, then you're spending a lot of time calling into leads where you're not likely to produce a result, but you're still expending energy calling into those. Let me pause. Does that make sense the way that I explained it? It's slightly complex.
I think so. I think so. And I think there's always a debate as to, this is an interesting discussion, how many calls should I do, but which accounts, how deep should I try to penetrate? 5 calls on everything or 3 calls on my best? So I think it's a point to probably continue to debate and discuss.
What we would recommend is, first of all, do scoring on the accounts that you're calling into. Is this the right account for us to be selling into? And then the contact. So if you know that it's an account you want to sell to, then making 3 or 4 or 5 contact attempts to one person and then setting it aside saying they didn't respond, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You know, right? If this is a great account for you to be calling into, if you scored all that and then you just try to reach one person and then give up, it's probably not going to be the optimal strategy, right? So the strategy and the amount of effort that you put in should be governed by how good of an opportunity you think this is, right? And then specific to the people that you're trying to reach, if we know that we're trying to reach people at the VP level in the IT department, it's probably going to take 15 attempts to get that person on the phone. So if we make 4 or 5 attempts on each one of those, we're never going to get them on the phone. That's not going to happen. Right, and I'm just using some relatively random numbers there, but you get the idea. So we need to, one, make sure that we're investing our effort into the right accounts and making enough effort into those right accounts that we're likely to produce the best possible outcome. And then for each of the individuals that we call, we should be varying our investment in reaching those individuals based on what is likely to produce the best result. Now, before a tool like InsideSales.com or others, it would be very, very difficult to figure that out. But today, I'm saying everybody ought to be going to figure this out.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Interesting. So,
yeah.
So Kerry, we're getting close. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're getting close to wrapping up here. Any kind of closing remarks on Cadence and kind of how people should be thinking through that in a structured environment?
Yeah, so I'm very interested to see the kinds of research that are coming out of the mounds of data that you all have on Cadences. The question I get most often on Cadence is, what's the right mix of phone calls and emails and social touches to reach prospect? Now, when I've looked at Cadences, I don't find really reliable patterns in terms of the mix. In terms of the total number of contact attempts, we do see patterns, and those patterns I think people kind of understand. But the mix, I don't see patterns. So I'm interested to hear what you see in that. Part of what I do think is important here is that the execution and the quality of the execution of the touches is far more important than the mix of them. And so it's like a recipe or something like that. If you have lousy ingredients but the best recipe, you're still going to have a lousy outcome, right? So the ingredients have to be really good, and then if you have a good recipe, you'll get a great result. So in that analogy, the execution of the emails and the calls and the social touches, that's the quality of the ingredients, and then the cadence is the recipe. Right? So if you don't manage the ingredients and don't have the great ingredients, your cadence it's going to produce the best cadence you can produce with the lousy ingredients, but it's not going to produce a great result.
Yeah, we're trying to release this study on Thursday, Kerry, and we've kind of narrowed it down to 5 kind of pillars of a cadence. So you have your overall attempts, your duration of your cadence, your spacing, the media that you use, and then the content. So those are kind of the 5 pillars we've been studying around cadence. Again, duration, spacing, total number of attempts, media, and then content. And I feel like it'll be interesting to see which ones have the highest predictability. I'm with you that the number of touches, I mean, you can go knock on a door and you can ring a doorbell and you can, you can do these different things, but what you say in the conversation is going to be by far the most important. And so 2 of them have to work together, but I do feel like the execution, to your point, is probably going to be kind of the key to success. So, well, our time is running out. The thing is, it's always interesting to kind of see what people are doing versus what is actually leads to success. So one piece at a time here, but time is running out. A couple more questions, guys. We'll definitely try to get you some of these questions answered as we close up here. But I want to make sure we kind of get to the end and throw out one piece or one thought. And I'm just skipping ahead. So number 1, please do, if you haven't already, connect with Kerry and I. We'd love to continue the conversation around cadence, around reporting, around best practices. So please, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, you can catch us there. I want to throw out this idea. If you don't mind, let me ask you a few questions. One is, how many of you are excited about what we just talked about? I feel like there was a lot of great information shared, and we want to see if we can get you an offer that might be interesting to just take this to the next level. And I want to spend the next couple minutes going over an offer we created to help you implement some of the best practice concepts that we talked about specifically around cadence today. And so what we have here is a module that we've built, research that we've done on how to build a winning cadence. Now, what it goes through is a 5-step process that we've been really trying to track. How do you get to the nuts and bolts of a good cadence, a game plan, understanding positions, your target, the optimal sequence, the plays, the email strategies, the voicemail strategy. We've built it into a 1-hour training. And then we've included these 7 cadence templates that we found internally to be as effective as possible. Now, this is not going to focus on the content, to Kerry's point, but these are going to be the different sequences, the different activities, the order, the number of days between, the total duration. We've been, again, tracking those 5 pillars of cadence, trying to figure out what's working and what's not working. So you get those 7 cadence templates plus the 1-hour video, and then we've included a couple other things, some research on phone and email and voicemail best practices, and then some sample emails and voicemail scripts that is working for us internally. And so if you want to take the dive, if you want to go a little bit further down the path of cadence, certainly you can look at our product set. We've got a great option there, but we did want to say, hey, take this next step, check it out. We typically charge $99 for it. We're going for $38. You've got a link right down there at the bottom. You can go to Inside Sales Labs. That's labs.insidesales.com/courses/cadence. You've also got a link up in the top right-hand corner. But we'd love to continue this journey around cadence, continue the conversation. This offer is live for 7 days, and you can just digest some of our research best practice content on cadence. So with that, everybody, really looking forward to that conversation. A couple other questions I'll stick on and type those to you. Again, if you'd like to continue the dialogue, grab Kerry or myself on LinkedIn or Twitter. Kerry, thanks so much for joining, and for the audience, we're right at the top of the hour, so have a fantastic day.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Gabe.